You're a charity recruit, Commander. You don't belong here. Admiral Marcus Hale said it right in the middle of the crowded training yard, and the entire line of recruits fell silent, as if someone had squeezed the air out of their lungs. Commander Helena Ward stood tall, her expression unchanged, yet every gaze around her absorbed the humiliation Hale was trying to force upon her. He stepped closer, his voice lowered, but sharp enough to cut. Her past was fabricated. Her record was as thin as wet paper, her missions erased. And that commander rank, he said, only existed because someone pitied her. Helena held her gaze steady, then replied in a calm, even tone. With respect, Admiral, I built what the Navy asked me to build. The words weren't loud, but they were strong enough to ripple through the formation. Hale let out a contemptuous laugh, as if he wanted to crush the very last fragment of dignity she carried. She didn't belong here, he insisted, and he would prove it. Helena inhaled softly, asked for permission to speak freely, and then said, You're right. Sympathy does make a soldier weak, but underestimating the wrong one ends entire careers. No one moved. No one dared breathe. Something in her voice made the recruits instinctively step back, as though they had just brushed against a secret no one was meant to know. When Hale turned away, a whisper rose from the line, loud enough for everyone to hear, yet quiet enough that no one would claim it. Ghost 7. The name hit the air like metal striking stone, and just then, the training whistle blared across the yard, slicing through the tension that had ballooned to the brink of bursting, signaling that nothing from this moment on would ever be the same. If you believe that true courage isn't found in the sound of gunfire, but in the silence carried by those who have walked through war, then subscribe to Brave Veteran Stories so we can preserve the memories, the dignity, and the reverence owed to our quiet heroes. Helena left the training yard in silence, her footsteps steady, as if each one was trying to hold together whatever remained of her composure after that public humiliation. The sound of her boots striking the stone floor came in short, dry echoes, each one reminding her that even after surviving years in the shadows of the battlefield, there were pains that didn't need bullets to pierce the heart of a soldier. No one followed her. No one dared call her back. The quiet surrounding a person who had endured more loss than any human should bear made the entire training field instinctively part to both sides, letting her walk through like a presence no one could touch. Inside her quarters, Helena set an old watch on the table. The watch had stayed with her since the final year, with her unit, one of the rare objects that survived alongside her after a mission buried under layers of code names and redacted reports. The second hand ticked in tiny, relentless steps, each one marking a corner of memory she never wanted to revisit, yet could never forget. Next to it was a photograph of 6 people in desert fatigues, sunburned faces, exhausted smiles that somehow still felt real. Those people had once been her shoulders, her family, the reason she stood up through moments when she had no strength left to breathe. Her eyes moved slowly across each face. Then a flash of memory tore through her sharp as a blade scorching sand striking her skin, helicopters circling above the crackling static of a radio in her ear. A command echoed each word, gritty as if coated in dust. Ghost 7, maintain your perimeter. She heard every syllable, felt as though, if she opened her eyes, she would once again see that scorched horizon and smell the thick haze of smoke clogging her throat. Helena shut her eyes tightly. A long breath left her chest, the kind released by someone who had survived too many times, so many, that even she sometimes forgot how she made it through. A knock tapped gently on the door. Lieutenant Rowan, the young recruit, still carrying the tight nervousness of someone who had just witnessed something he shouldn't have stepped inside. He stood straight, hands clasped tightly together, as though trying to hold down his worry. Admiral Hale requested your clearance files. Full access. Rowan said, his voice almost apologetic. Helena didn't look at him at first. Her eyes drifted toward the window, to the gray sky resting still like unmoving water. A long silence passed before she finally replied, her voice low and even. If he finds something, Lieutenant, then it's because someone wanted him to find it. Rowan didn't understand. He just stood there, a young soldier, far too new to the games of power, far too new to the shadows that uniforms could never fully hide. But Helena understood. She understood well. When files were blacked out, not to protect someone, but to bury something too real and too dangerous, anyone who tried to dig would inevitably be pulled into a storm they never expected. Helena knew this better than anyone, and Hale attempting to access layers of data far beyond his authority meant only one thing: the game had begun, and someone wanted him pushed right into the center of it. Rowan opened his mouth as if to ask another question, But Helena gave a slight shake of her head. He understood. That was his cue to leave. When the door closed, Helena remained alone in the small room, listening to the ticking of that old watch, running with a determination that felt cruel. Time always moved faster than healing, and faster than the pace at which someone tried to forget the things they were forced to live with forever. She looked at the photo again. 6 people, and now only 1. And when the name Ghost 7 was whispered on the training field, Helena knew the life she thought she had buried beneath new assignments was being pulled back up piece by piece. And in that moment of quiet, another humiliation revealed itself, one far deeper, far heavier, not brought on by people, but by the very system that had once used her, then tried to bury her existence along with the truths she carried. Rumors always travel faster than the truth, and inside military bases, they cut sharper than any unfriendly stare. By the end of a single morning, Helena had become the center of whispered conversations, whispers spoken just quietly enough to pretend discretion, yet loud enough for her to hear every word. They said she had failed her security review, that her records had discrepancies, that she was about to be reassigned because too many pages were blacked out. No one said it to her face, but they didn't need to. The tightening ring of suspicion was palpable with every step she took. Every time Helena walked through a hallway, the air shifted. Some people fell into an unnatural silence. Some turned their eyes away. Others even sidestepped as if avoiding the space immediately around her. An invisible distance formed not by regulation, but by fear and curiosity. Those stares didn't touch her skin, but they weighed heavier on her shoulders than any combat pack she had carried through years in the Middle East. In a corner of the corridor, where a group of young officers leaned against the wall, a voice rose as she passed Ghost 7. If that's even real. Just a half-mocking line tossed casually, but it pierced straight through everything Helena had spent years trying to keep still. Memories surged without warning, her teammates lying angled in the burning sand, fingers still gripping their rifles, as if holding on to their last mission. The radio crackling seconds from cutting out, yet clear enough to deliver the order that froze her heartbeat every time she remembered it: execute. An order the entire team knew was wrong, but had no authority to refuse. And in that moment, half her unit never returned. Helena walked faster, not looking back. But the words followed her like a long shadow across the desert. She reached her room, opened a drawer, and pulled out a document she should have burned years ago. A copy of the classified directive signed by the commander who once fought beside her, then turned his back in the most painful hour. The paper was frayed at the edges, the lines as cold and rigid as the first day she read them. A living piece of evidence for something people had tried to hide, erase, and bury under layers of redacted ink. She picked up the photograph of her 6-person team, 4 men, 2 women. Sun-scorched faces, exhausted smiles, eyes burning with a resilience only those who lived on the edge of life and death could understand. Each face was a memory Helena carried sometimes as a reminder, sometimes as a sentence. Her hand trembled slightly as she held the picture. A small tremor she couldn't control, the reflex of wounds that had healed on the surface but still ached deep inside. Outside, footsteps echoed down the hallway. The same young officer from earlier stopped at her door, his eyes still sharp with challenge. He wanted her to react, to snap, to show a weakness he could turn into the next story to pass around the base. But Helena simply met his gaze for a few seconds, said nothing, then turned away. That silence wasn't weakness. It was the silence of someone who had survived places the people pointing fingers today would never dare step into. In the small room, Helena sat and placed the photograph before her. There was no anger in her eyes, only the quiet sorrow of someone who knew too well that the world carried wounds no official file would ever acknowledge. And those who bore them were often judged through the shallow eyes of people who couldn't tell truth from rumor. She closed the drawer. The noise of the base seemed to dissolve. A thought lingered in her mind. Some battles aren't fought in dust or gunfire, but inside rigid walls, and in the lines of documents no one is allowed to read. And this time she was being pushed back onto that battlefield, simply because one man refused to accept that some things were bigger than his authority. And from that very humiliation, Helena felt something shift behind her, a subtle but powerful movement, the first signs of a chain of events no one on the base was prepared for. Rumors in the base were already tense, but what made everything rupture came from the youngest people there. While Hale stood in the middle of the training yard, unleashing one cutting remark after another on Helena, several recruits instinctively lifted their phones. Some recorded out of shock, some out of curiosity, and some because the injustice was so clear that silence felt impossible. The clip lasted only a few seconds, but it caught everything. Hale shouting Helena standing still, and the chilling silence of someone who had lived far past the line of life and death. Minutes later, the video appeared on the base's internal network. No one dared comment publicly, but messages began flowing through private groups. She didn't even fight back. Hale went too far. Look at her eyes, like she already knew what was coming. The image of Helena standing calmly before Hale's anger struck many deeper than they expected. Not because she looked strong, but because that calm carried a different kind of pain, the pain of someone once used as a tool, then erased from the very records written with her blood. Inside the internal command office, a senior officer happened to glance at the computer screen of a duty clerk. The video autoplayed. He stood frozen for several seconds, the eyes of a man who had seen too much narrowing slightly. Then he set the folder in his hand down and said only 3 words, firm and decisive. "Get my car." On the other side of the base, Helena walked along the quiet northern buildings seeking a moment of silence, but instead encountered someone she never expected, Colonel Adrian Cross, her former commanding officer in Ghost 7. His face carried the fatigue of many years of service, yet his eyes were as sharp as the day they stood together on the same battlefield. Cross didn't greet her, didn't circle around the point. His voice came low and weighted, as if each word carried a warning that could cost lives. Hale is digging with the wrong clearance. They'll erase him, the way they tried to erase us. Helena met his gaze not with surprise, but with recognition. What she feared was now unfolding. Someone behind the scenes wanted to push Hale into destruction, not to protect her, but to bury whatever he was getting too close to uncover. Cross opened his old shoulder bag and took out a small metal-encased hard drive. He placed it into Helena's hand. His fingers trembled not from fear, but from understanding the weight of what he was giving her and how many careers, how many lives it could change. "This is everything, and it can burn half the brass." Helena held the drive. It was cold as steel, yet burned in her palm like a body still warm from the battlefield. Inside it lived everything they had fought for, everything they had lost, everything they had been betrayed, for everything the government had tried to bury under the word classified. Cross looked at her for a long time. "If they know you're still holding this, they won't let you stay on this base another day." Helena exhaled softly. "I know." And it wasn't the breath of someone afraid. It was the breath of someone ready to stand once more, even when the enemy no longer carried rifles, but ranks, authority, and absolute power. As they stood there, a sweep of lights crossed the yard, sliding over the white walls of the buildings. A convoy was approaching. Tires rolled slowly but steadily across the pavement, as if signaling that whatever Helena now held would not remain hidden for long. Neither spoke again. They didn't need to. Both understood the game had changed. She was no longer the only target. Anyone who knew the truth was now in the line of fire. And in that moment, as the lights moved across the courtyard, Helena felt the shift in power drawing closer with every second, an approaching presence strong enough to turn the entire situation on its head, opening the way for a reversal no one on the base had foreseen. The sound of engines grew louder in the distance, not the ordinary hum of patrol vehicles, but the unmistakable tone of a command convoy. The soldiers in the base courtyard immediately turned toward the main gate, where a line of gray-painted military vehicles was slowly advancing into the center of the training grounds. The tires halted right in the middle of the yard, and an officer stepped out of the first vehicle, standing straight before moving aside. Vice Admiral Ross Calder emerged. No orders were needed. Almost instantly, every officer within several dozen meters snapped to attention. It wasn't common to see Calder appear. Even less common to see him show up when no official ceremony was underway. His presence alone straightened the atmosphere, as if the entire base had been forced to pull its spine upright all at once. Calder didn't look around. He walked forward with firm, deliberate steps toward Helena, who was standing quietly at the edge of the courtyard after her encounter with Colonel Cross. Hale stood not far away, completely bewildered, unable to fathom why his superior had arrived at this exact moment. Calder stopped right before Helena. His gaze was sharp, but not cold. There was a very clear respect in his eyes, so unmistakable that the crowd surrounding them fell into complete silence. He spoke first, his voice precise and resonant, Commander Ward. "It's an honor. Not a whisper. Not a murmur." The silence froze in place the moment the words left his lips. Helena straightened slightly, not out of pride, but because the acknowledgement came from a man who had held life and death authority on more battlefields than most could imagine. Hale watched the scene with an expression he could no longer hide, stunned, confused, shaken to the core. He turned toward the other officers as though waiting for someone to explain why the woman he had humiliated now stood receiving open respect. Calder tilted his head just enough for his voice to carry across the gathered officers, Ghost 7. I didn't expect to see the last survivor standing here. The words fell onto the courtyard like a slab of steel slamming into the ground. No one moved. Many stared wide-eyed, unable to believe what they had just heard. Even the recruits who recorded the scene earlier that morning felt a chill run down their backs. They didn't fully grasp the significance of the name Ghost 7. But the way Calder spoke, and the reaction of everyone around them, told them this was no nickname. It was a history almost no one dared to mention. Hale stepped forward half a pace, his voice catching in his throat. Sir? What do you mean the last survivor? Calder didn't answer immediately. He looked at Hale as though reassessing the man entirely. Then he spoke slowly. There are some units you don't touch unless you understand the price they paid. Ghost 7 is one of them. Helena remained silent. But the silence wasn't humiliation. This time it had become a wall of unbreakable dignity. People looked at her differently now, as if they were seeing two overlapping images, a commander under suspicion, and a soldier who had survived battlefields that never made it into official history. Hale looked from Helena to Calder, and for the first time fear flickered in his eyes. Not because he believed he had insulted the wrong person, but because he realized he had reached into a file that had been buried for over a decade, one capable of swallowing his entire career whole. Calder said nothing more. His presence alone rebalanced the shifting order of the base. No explanation needed. No threat required. When someone of his rank said the words, "It's an honor," everything else moved into its rightful place. And from that single acknowledgement, a new ripple began to spread, a movement pointing directly toward a truth no one could conceal any longer. The base courtyard fell into absolute silence as Vice Admiral Ross Calder stood before everyone, as if his presence alone was a signal commanding every heart to pause for a single heavy beat. He looked around once, then let his gaze settle on Helena where she stood. No hesitation, no avoidance. He began to speak in a low, steady voice that hid nothing. Ghost 7 wasn't a rumor, he said. It was a special operations unit deployed during the Seraph Gate mission, a mission erased from the records. The soldiers closest to him stiffened. A few swallowed hard. They had all heard stories of shadowed operations, but it was rare, almost unheard of, for a senior officer to mention one aloud in front of an entire formation. Calder continued. Her team was ordered to carry out an operation that should never have existed. A faint murmur swept through the courtyard, but it vanished instantly as his voice cut through it with more weight than any reaction could hold. Inside Helena's mind, familiar images returned, not loud, not prolonged, but clipped and merciless, like scars reopening all at once. A small town full of civilians. An order to fire that should never have been given. Her brothers and sisters in arms refusing it with absolute resolve. And then names that disappeared forever. Calder turned toward Hale, his eyes locking onto the Admiral, who now stood frozen in place. You tried to expose her, he said, slow and deliberate, each word landing like a blow on concrete. Instead, you exposed yourself. Hale's face drained of color. It was no longer the discomfort of an officer being corrected by a superior. It was the look of a man realizing he had placed his hand on a door that should never have been opened. A few nearby recruits lowered their heads, not out of fear, but out of shame on behalf of the man who had tried to humiliate a soldier, carrying memories they were far too young to comprehend. A young officer on the right side whispered just loudly enough for a few to hear, "Sir." "Was Seraph Gate real?" Calder responded without glancing at him's yield. "And the price of it was real as well." Helena remained silent. No self-defense, no tears. She stood at the border of two worlds, one where she had once been ordered to act against her conscience, and the world now where the truth was finally being spoken for her. Her hands curled into fists, but did not shake. Only the invisible weight of the past pressed on her shoulders, a burden she had learned to carry long ago. Another recruit stepped back half a pace and whispered to the one beside him, "I can't believe she went through all that alone." A few more lowered their eyes, solemn and shaken. Calder looked toward Helena for a moment, as if to remind everyone that this truth no longer belonged only to her. It had been spoken aloud before the entire base, and once spoken, truth could not be forced back into the shadows. Hale tried to force out a sentence, but his voice broke apart. "Sir, I only wanted to confirm." Calder cut him off, his voice no longer cold, but heavy, carrying the weight of judgment. "You didn't want to confirm. You wanted to prove her wrong. And in doing so, you proved you understand nothing about the people you claim to evaluate." A soft breeze crossed the courtyard. And for the first time that morning, the soldiers looked at Helena not with suspicion, but with the eyes one reserves for someone carrying more than her own life on her shoulders. Helena still said nothing, because when the truth is big enough, the person who lived it doesn't have to speak. It stands on its own. Calder concluded, his voice dropping into a tone that sounded almost like a tribute. Her team died because they refused a wrong order. She survived because she kept the truth alive. It wasn't praise. It was a silent offering to those who no longer stood there. And as the story was finally laid bare before the entire base, Helena understood that a lesson had to be passed on, not through anger, but through the quiet grace of someone who still remained standing after everything others tried so hard to forget. Hale stepped back as if the ground had shifted beneath him. He opened his mouth, but his voice rasped, breaking into a few frail words, far weaker than the authority he once carried. I didn't know. The sentence fell heavy like a late confession, and the entire base fell silent for several long seconds, longer than any inspection parade. Helena looked at him, not with anger, but with the sorrow of someone who had witnessed too many cycles of human error. She spoke slowly, her voice low and steady. Some truths aren't hidden. People just don't want to see them. In places like this, truth doesn't disappear. It's simply buried under pride, under the fear of confronting it, under the illusion that authority gives someone the right to point fingers at anyone they choose. A hesitant footstep drew Helena's attention. Lieutenant Rowan, his face still carrying the innocence of a young recruit, unaccustomed to the darker corners of military life, approached. He lowered his head, his voice soft but sincere enough to reveal genuine remorse. Ma'am, I was wrong. I shouldn't have doubted you. The tremor in his voice wasn't fear of Helena, but fear of his own recklessness. Helena placed a hand on his shoulder so gently it could only be felt by someone standing very close. Learn from this. Pride is loud, but honor is quiet. Honor doesn't shout. It doesn't prove itself through power. It is forged in the hard choices no one sees, and sometimes only recognized after everything has been lost. Rowan swallowed his shame, but a different light appeared in his eyes, the light of growing up. Helena knew moments like this were rare moments when a young soul truly understood the weight of the rank resting on their shoulders. That moment pulled Helena back into one final memory she had never allowed herself to face fully. Elias's voice crackling through the radio, weakening with every second as red dust swirled around them. Ward! Hold your line! Ward! Respond! Then a violent explosion. And after that, only silence. A silence that lived inside her far longer than any nightmare. It followed her everywhere, a reminder that she survived, not because she was stronger, but because someone else never made it out of that operation. Helena closed her eyes for just a brief second. When she opened them again, Rowan was waiting for her next words. Hale stood frozen, and the other soldiers were slowly realizing they had not witnessed an ordinary confrontation. They had witnessed the rising of a truth no one could erase. Behind the formation, no one spoke, but many eyes had changed. The shift did not come from reports or rank, but from the realization of the contrast laid bare in front of them, the loud voice of pride and the heavy silence of a survivor. Helena stepped back, not to leave, but as if to let the entire courtyard see more clearly the lesson she had just left behind without teaching it outright. Honor is not something to display, but something to carry. And sometimes forgiveness is the strongest evidence of courage. And as silence slowly settled over the courtyard once more, everyone felt that what came next would not just be the truth, but the price of that truth, a price Hale would soon have to face as a consequence no one could shield him from. In the days following that fateful morning, Norfolk Base seemed to shift into a different rhythm. The meaningless whispers were gone. The prying eyes faded away. What remained was a quiet that seeped into every building, as if everyone was trying to understand more about the woman who had stood in the center of a storm without taking a single step back. And in that silence, the Navy issued an official order. Protocol 7. A new regulation requiring that any investigation involving classified records be overseen by a special counsel and never conducted without the highest authorization. The name 7 stirred curiosity among many. But those who knew of Ghost 7 understood this wasn't an honor. It was a reminder that an entire unit had once been erased from history because of a mistake no one dared to speak about. This order was a marker, a promise that what had been buried would never be allowed to happen again. For Marcus Hale, the announcement arrived on the very morning he showed up at his office for the last time. His access was revoked, his position stripped. The uniform still rested on his shoulders, but everything he once relied on to stand tall before the troops now crumbled into an emptiness no authority could fill. He left the base in silence. No farewells, no curses thrown his way. Only a few people standing at a distance watching him step into a car that no longer bore the insignia of command. Some felt pity, some felt nothing. But others understood more deeply that sometimes the greatest collapse doesn't come from a demotion, but from the moment a man is forced to confront himself. On the opposite side of the base, Helena walked alone toward the memorial square. No one followed her. No one needed to. This was her path, one her fallen teammates had walked to the end, and one she was destined to continue alone. The sea breeze brushed against the monument, gliding over the engraved names of those who had gone before her. Helena laid the old watch gently atop the line she had carried in her heart for years. "We're still here." Her voice was soft, almost only for herself. But the words formed a new vow, a reminder to those who had fallen that their existence had not been erased, even if the official records claimed otherwise. Rowan stood behind her a few steps away, his posture straight, and his eyes holding a pride far greater than when she first met him. He didn't speak. Helena didn't ask him to. But when she turned, he immediately snapped into a salute, not for rank, but out of respect for a soldier who had held her honor intact through circumstances that would have broken most people. In that brief moment, Helena understood that everything she had endured had meaning. Because a soldier's true legacy isn't in the medals on their chest, it's in the lessons the young carry from their silence. Lessons about sacrifice, about standing firm against wrongful orders, and about loyalty to values far greater than any command. She picked up the watch, stood straight, and let the ocean wind carry away the heaviest part of her memory. Not to forget, but to walk forward lighter, because there were still things she had to do, still people she had to protect, and truths that had yet to be told. This story doesn't end here. It simply marks the beginning of a new chapter. A chapter where the soldier rises, telling history through the life they lived, so future generations won't bear the weight of the same mistakes. Brave veteran stories. We remember the quiet heroes. If this story makes you believe that honor and kindness never retire, share this video and subscribe to Brave Veteran Stories so that none of their memories are ever forgotten.